Hello and welcome. Switched on with Joseph Barnett. Thank you very much for listening in. And I'll say it before I say it on my every show that I do. Make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you are watching on YouTube, that is. It's the bottom left-hand corner. Make sure you subscribe before you watch the show. And because I need subscribers, and it gets a class of guests that I've got on today. And without further ado, I'll introduce him. He is a former MP, presenter, author, and political commentator. That is Mr. George Galloway.
Very nice to be here.
Thank you very much for coming on, George.
It's terrific.
Thank you, mate. Thank you very much for coming on. It's been fantastic to, get someone like you on, and this is the type of guest that I want to get on, just to discuss politics and modern day subjects. But how you dealing with the current pandemic and COVID and things like that? What's your take on?
Well, I've been very lucky because I have a big family. None of us have caught it. I have always been working more or less from home, so there's been no change for me. I haven't lost a day's work all year, but so many millions of people have had their lives devastated, economic life, or if they were unlucky enough to be caught up with the virus, perhaps serious and ongoing risk to their health. So I thank my lucky stars, and I'm deeply sorry for all the suffering that there is in the country. I was just driving through, shouldn't have, Knightsbridge today, and the number of people around is minuscule at a time of the year that you would normally not be able to move for the crowds. So the economy has taken really a gigantic hit.
Yeah.
But touch wood, so far, so good for us.
Well, London apparently is going to go into a tier 3 now next week.
Yes.
And economically, the damage it's going to do, it's...
We're in tier Z economically, I think.
I know. It's just getting to a point now where you start to think that what the actual damage and what the actual, outcomes of people will end up dying when you lower the GDP rate because of the economy down.
Yeah, people die of poverty too.
Yeah. And it's not
people die of problems with their mental health wrought by all this miserable year, the depression of it, the isolation of it, and so on. It's really incalculable at this point.
So, like all my guests, George, I just want to touch on your life, really, and just pick up on certain things. And I read something about you that, when you first got started off in politics, I know you're from Dundee. And you was a very young boy, what, you 13 years old?
I was. Well, I joined the Labour Party at 13, but I'd been active for many years before that. Yeah, I mean, literally in short trousers. My parents were very political people. My mother's still alive. She still is. So I was brought up in that atmosphere. I remember very vividly in 1964, so I was exactly 10, our whole house was darkened for at least 4 weeks because all of our windows were completely covered by posters of Harold Wilson, the Labour leader, who won that election in 64. I remember even the slogan, it was, "Let's go with Labour," and a big picture of Mr. Wilson. And it literally shut out the sunlight from our house for the entirety of the general election. In another general election, 74, we had a gable end. Do you call that a gable end?
Yeah.
We had a gable end, and the entire end was utilized for the biggest poster you've ever seen. Every inch of it was. So, I was born into a political family, yeah.
So how did that end up then evolving into you sort of running for local councillor, was it? Did you start off and then...
No, I actually became the Labour Party organiser, full-time organiser, in 1977. So I was 23. So I was the paid full-time boss of the two Labour parties in the city. So the councillors answered to me, you might say. We had a very tight ship. We ran a very tight ship then, and those were great days. I've written and narrated a talking book about the 1970s called Street Fighting Years, and they really were tumultuous years. It was no surprise to me when on Life on Mars, if you ever saw it.
Yeah, I have seen it. Yeah.
The copper decided to take a leap off the roof and go back to the 1970s. These were great days.
I can imagine politics has changed dramatically.
Tremendously. And
within the Labour Party.
Not for the best, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in the 1970s, we were strong. The trade unions were strong. The left was strong. The socialist idea was strong. There was a socialist camp in the world. I had a big map of the world with little red stickers in, which were our countries. And they just grew and grew throughout the 1970s. So there were times of great optimism.
Yeah.
And I had to laugh when the Tories said of Jeremy Corbyn in the last general election that he'll take you back to the 70s. Yes, when everybody could get a job, everybody could get a council house, when the National Health Service was entirely free, when you even got free school milk when you were a kid at school. And so many things were better. Some things were worse, of course, but so many things were better.
He didn't fit in, Jeremy Corbyn, did he? Was he too old-fashioned in regards to he was an old-school politician?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, he made a lot of mistakes. And some of those mistakes turned out to be fatal.
Was that the anti-Semitism?
The Brexit issue was what really killed him. And this was caused by him pretending to believe in one thing whilst actually believing in another.
Yes.
That's never a good idea in politics. But you're right. He never fitted in because he represented a challenge to the prevailing orthodoxy. The power in the land didn't want to take the risk of Jeremy Corbyn PM.
So what was your transition then? So you run for MP in Scotland, didn't you? But then you come down
to... I actually defeated a really big figure in British politics, a man called Roy Jenkins, who'd been the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary, President of the European Union. And I dumped him on his well-upholstered backside into the House of Lords, for which he thanked me later, because it's an easier billet, I can assure you. So I beat him in 1987, when most people wouldn't have expected that. And I beat everybody again then in 92, in 97, and then 2001. And then Tony Blair expelled me from the Labour Party over the Iraq War. And he abolished my constituency, just in case. So I was forced to move roundabout to here, to East London, and I defeated Labour on my own in 2005, and took, you might say, another big scalp. Una King was a Blair babe, as they used to call them in those days, believe it or not. She was one of the stars of the Blair outfit, and I defeated her in Bethnal Green and Bow in 2005.
That's incredible. Running for independent.
Yeah, and then I did it again in 2012 with a 10,000 majority, this time in Bradford. So actually, Mr. Churchill and me, words you never thought you'd hear, the only people ever to win seats in 3 different cities in 2 different countries, Scotland and England.
That's incredible.
So, yeah, it's not a bad record.
Man of the people. I will jump back on that, like the expulsion from the Labour Party in the Iraq War, and obviously us looking back on that is probably one of the biggest travesties that have ever been undertaken in history. Millions of people, either their lives ruined and thousands of people killed. And then it evolved, didn't it? And how you're involved in the accusations when you went to the Senate as well for the alleged oil trading was complete.
A good day.
Yeah, I actually watched that. It was incredible how you actually faced them. But was there many people in the Labour Party at the time speaking out against the Iraq War, or was you sort of isolated in that as soon as you started speaking out against the narrative?
There were many others in the Labour Party speaking out against the war, but none of them quite as strongly to the point that they'd get kicked out, and none of them with the authority of knowing Iraq really well. I think that was my I'm not going to say mistake because I couldn't have done anything else, but it was the X factor. It was the thing that got me kicked out. You see, I, alone in British politics and media, knew Iraq extremely well. And therefore I knew that Blair was lying. And because I knew that he was lying, I could not in conscience remain silent about that. So once you are in the position where you're having to call the leader of your own party in public a liar, you're on borrowed time. Now, nobody else did that. Some of them because they didn't have the courage to do it. Others, to be fair, because they couldn't have known that for certain in the way that I knew it for certain. Let me tell you quickly how I knew it for certain, even if I hadn't instinctively known it for sure. Tony Blair published a dossier in which he named, I forget how many now, 20 or 30 places where he said weapons of mass destruction were being hidden. I arranged with the Iraqi government before they knew what was in the dossier. So before they knew what places were going to be named, for the entire British press corps to be taken to any or all of the places that Tony Blair was about to name. So I stood in the queue at the table office at 9 o'clock in the morning and got the first copy of the dossier, phoned Iraq, read out the names and addresses of all the places that Blair said there were weapons of mass destruction. And the whole British press corps jumped into cars, all facilitated by the Iraqis, and went to any one of those 20 or so places that they wanted to. Of course, there were no weapons of mass destruction in any of them. So I knew that he was lying, and if you have a conscience, and I do, you have no alternative but to say so. And that's what got me kicked out of the Labour Party. Tony Benn and Michael Foot, God rest them both, they came to my expulsion and gave evidence on my behalf, character reference, if you like, called on the Labour Party not to do it. But they did it. The rest is history.
What was the real motive, do you think, with you? Was it resources?
I think it was three things. First of all, it was for oil, as most people, I think, now accept. Secondly, it was for Israel, and that's the same reason for the now confrontation with Iran, same reason. But these were the two minor reasons. The major reason was to demonstrate the overwhelming power of the United States as we entered the 21st century. They had decided that this was going to be a new American century. Of course, 20 years on, it's catastrophically failed. No one, not even a single American, could, with their hand on their heart, say that they believed this was going now to be an American century. It's a Chinese century already, and it's only 2020. But that was their plan. So they wanted to terrify the world with American power. And like a boomerang, it completely failed.
Well, if you look at the Middle Eastern countries now, in particular Iraq, after the invasion, and such a bad situation that they're in now, and you look at Syria and all of these other countries that have had intervention, they're in a terrible situation, far worse than what they was originally.
Yes, no one could dispute that, at least not honestly. The only thing I did not predict, and what I did predict came true in every particular, but the one thing I could not have predicted was that the Al-Qaeda, whose resurgence I predicted if Bush and Blair invaded Iraq, would actually be replaced by something even worse than Al-Qaeda, namely ISIS. My imagination wasn't fertile enough to imagine that out of this carnage would emerge a force so big and so evil that the cutting off of heads of priests and nuns and journalists and aid workers and anyone who disagreed with them would become so routine that you could pave the road from here to Baghdad with severed heads. I couldn't have predicted that and didn't.
It's incredible. It really is, and that's just when you have these Western civilizations like America and the UK and the invasion of Iraq, and you're upset the civilization there and how these groups emerge through hatred, and then that's why they've got such a large gathering, I assume, and people joining in just to fight the Western armies.
Well, that's right. And as I predicted to Mr. Blair, not just there but here. In the last conversation I ever had with him in the library corridor in the House of Commons, just outside the gentleman's lavatory to be precise, I said to him 3 things. That if you and Bush invade Iraq, Baghdad will quickly fall, but it will not be the beginning of the end, only the end of the beginning. Number 2, that the Iraqis will fight you with their teeth, if necessary, until they drive you from their country. And number 3, that if you do this, there are no Al-Qaeda in Iraq now, but there'll be 100,000 Al-Qaeda, another underestimation. There'll be 100,000 Al-Qaeda in Iraq before you can say Jack Robinson. And that these people will not remain in Iraq. They will cascade everywhere across the world, including here. And that exactly happened. And now we have this mentality present everywhere. I could throw a stone from this studio and land somewhere. It would land somewhere where there's somebody harboring these thoughts. And they may not act on them. God forbid that they do. But they might, and they have.
It's just not publicised the way, you know, we talk about the invasion in Iraq and how it's disrupted the countries and how it's actually led to this, but it's just a cycle of how it evolves, because we vote for these governments to go into place, and they continue to do this, continue to disrupt these countries, and then we ask the question of why it's happening. Oh, look at these terrorists. We're not dealing with it in the right way. We're not asking the questions and saying why we always seem to be invading these countries. Why have we always got an investment into these countries?
Yeah, even worse, we say, why do they hate us so much? You know, I learned a lesson long ago that in order to understand something, you've got to be able to walk in the other person's shoes. It's what's called empathy.
Yeah.
You have to understand how this looks to them, feels to them, is to them. And if you spent 5 minutes doing that, you'd know why they hate us. You know, it's like smashing into someone's home, killing half their family, kicking them out into the garden under canvas, and then asking, why do these people hate us? It's a ridiculous, absurd question. And yet that was, for some years, after the invasion of Iraq, a prevailing narrative that somehow these people hate us because of the length of the skirts that the girls wear in Copenhagen or Vice in Soho.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with that. It's because we either prop up dictatorships in their country, sell them guns, train their soldiers and the police. In the case of Saudi Arabia, right now, we've sold £5 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia in 5 years. We are training their soldiers and their police officers to subjugate their own people. And when the day comes that their own people overthrow them, we'll ask, why do these people hate us? So either we prop up their dictators or we invade them, in the case of Iraq, in order to overthrow a dictator that we used to support. So why do these people hate us? why would they not?
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. I've never understood our intervention in the Middle East and how it's gone for many years. I mean, we're reading a university study and how, you look at some of the African countries and what some of our governments say and how they're intervening with countries. Oh, it's to implement a democracy. It's to do this. It's to do that. When really we'd be doing that in so many countries around the world.
Well, we did it before we were a democracy,
Yeah.
never mind them.
But it just seems to be it's always in the Middle East, and then you have to look into it with the resources and what they offer and where they're positioned. And that seems to be the main reason for it. And,
We had an empire on which the sun never set. It was so vast.
Mm.
Although, as my Irish grandfather used to say, that's because God would never trust the British in the dark. We were not a democracy, never mind them. The soldiers we sent to conquer Africa and Asia didn't have a vote. Even their officers were lucky to have only the most senior officers had a vote when we conquered the world. So that wasn't for democracy. So why should we believe it's for democracy now?
I know. I certainly don't. So what was the roundabout time when you got accused of the oil trading deal and then you had to go to the Senate? Was that around the time of the...
It was exactly 2005.
So was this the reason because you were very outspoken about the Iraq war, or you were a position that and they went for you? Or
Not just me. The Pope's secretary, Nelson Mandela's secretary, the foreign minister of France. It was like there was a hit list of the most prominent, maybe effective anti-war leaders. Okay, we've smashed through the gates of Baghdad. We've taken control of the city. Let's now deal with the people that stood against us. And it's now history. It's my best day ever. But I can say that Saddam Hussein never gave me a brass farthing, but the newspapers that alleged that he did had to give me millions. And I mean millions.
wow,
The Daily Telegraph itself had to pay out £2.4 million for that story. The Christian Science Monitor, £250,000, and many others. So Saddam never gave me anything, but the newspapers had to give me plenty.
that's
Karma. Call it karma.
They claimed that you met him many times, as you said in the Senate. Which is complete. You
I
met him twice. Yeah,
The same number of times that Donald Rumsfeld, the
That's right.
U.S. Defense Secretary, had met him. The difference being he was meeting him to sell him guns and gas.
and that's exactly what you said, wasn't it?
Exactly. And give him the maps with which to target them.
What was I've got to ask you, what was he like, Saddam Hussein?
Not what you would think, not what you were led to believe. Steady, sane, strong, determined, and now 10 times the giant figure that he might ever have been in life.
It's almost a martyr.
Saddam Hussein will be remembered in Arab history far better than Tony Blair and George Bush will be remembered in our history. He was always a political enemy of mine. I never visited Iraq. It was the only Arab country, practically, that I had never visited prior to 93. And I would have been arrested if I had, because I was a part of the opposition to Saddam Hussein here in Britain, where there were thousands of exiles who had been driven from Iraq by him and by his regime. So I never went to Iraq. I'd have been afraid to do so. He was, of course, a brutal dictator. We now know that Iraq is a very difficult place to govern, and frankly, like most Arab countries, maybe others beyond the Arab world, was a country ill-drawn. We drew it. I spent nearly 30 years in Parliament. I walked every day past the room where the maps of the Middle East were drawn by people who really didn't know anything about the area they were carving up. And they put together a country called Iraq, Mesopotamia at that time, which wasn't really a country and contained within it such vast confessional and religious differences as to make it ungovernable, except in a very brutal way. In fact, the only time that there has been an Iraq, a single Iraq, that thought of itself as an Iraq was under Saddam Hussein. The rest of the time, people regarded themselves as being Kurdish or Shiite or Sunni or Christian or Yazidi or any of the dozens of religious confessional groups in Iraq, or they regarded themselves as really Turkish in the north, or Turkic at least, or they regarded themselves as really Persian in the south, in Basra and so on. So it was a country that the imperial powers, France and Britain at that time, put together that was essentially inherently extremely difficult to keep together and to govern. And its only successful period, in fact, was in the 1960s and 70s under the Ba'ath Party, with him as the strongman and eventually the dictator. But our actions have been so bad that, as you said, and as almost all Iraqis would agree, we've been so bad that people wish they could go back to that period. That's how bad our decision-making was.
Yeah.
And as I say, nobody who knows the region could doubt that now, because Iraq is not one country. It's not even three countries. It's tens of countries with warlords and religious fiefdoms and so on.
There's a hell of a lot going on there, yeah. I mean, and it's a battle for the Middle East now between Saudi Arabia and Iran, isn't it? There seems to be an ongoing battle there, and the Americans obviously have been supplying arms to Saudi Arabia for many years. Again, it's not publicised, but we have.
No, and of course the same Saudi Arabia which supplied 13 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11, which is the fountainhead of Islamist extremism all over the world, which funds mosques, including in East London, to propagate that extremist interpretation of Islam. And yet somehow they're the good guys. Somehow they're our friends. That doesn't actually compute. Syria and Iraq, whatever else you might say about their governments, were secular powers. They tried to build nationalism, if you like, and Syrian nationalism, Iraqi nationalism, Arab nationalism, as opposed to Islamist fundamentalism. And we backed the fundamentalists. And then when those fundamentalists are running across London Bridge with sharp knives, we're astounded. You know, I said to David Cameron on my first day back when I was re-elected in 2012, did you read Frankenstein? And if you read it, did you read it right to the end? Because if you had, you'd know that Frankenstein made the monster, sure. But as soon as he'd made it, he was no longer in control of it. That's why it's called a monster. He didn't answer that question because there is no answer to it. We have made a monster of Islamist fundamentalism, done everything we could to destroy. Libya is another example. Yeah. Don't get me wrong, I'm not with Saddam, Bashar, or Gaddafi. Far from it in the latter case. Very far from it. But all three of these were secular Arab nationalist leaders. We destroyed, or tried to, in the case of Syria, destroyed these regimes, knowing that the only conceivable alternative to them was fundamentalism. And yet we chose the fundamentalists. Go figure.
It's incredible.
Go figure.
It is. It really is. And as you say, you made a very good point of how, because they're so separate in cultures in some of these countries, there've always been civil war and civil unrest. And in some cases, the better the devil you know in regards to Saddam Hussein, Colonel Gaddafi, because you look at the situations that these countries are in now, and, they're on their knees. It's complete civil war. There's no order. And now there's being intervention, isn't there, from all these different countries?
Libya no longer exists as a country.
It doesn't.
There are slave markets in Libya where black slaves are sold. We blew, in Michael Caine's words, we blew the bloody doors off. And then the people took to the sea and ended up in Europe in gigantic numbers. Libya has no frontiers, has no border, no army, no government, no parliament, nothing. And that was us that did that. Take a bow.
I know. And no one, it's not publicised. No one talks about it. No. It just talks about the initial...
Well, we talk about the consequences.
Yeah.
We bemoan
that's right.
the washing up on the shores of Europe of hundreds of thousands of refugees without even contemplating for a moment that we caused these refugees. We caused them both to flee and to be able to get through the gates.
I know. I completely agree. And I wanted to pick you up, part of the Middle East as well, because I know you're very passionate about Free Palestine and the obviously with the Labour Party, and especially Jeremy Corbyn and the anti-Semitism thing. What was happening in regards to that? I mean, was it massively sort of over-evaluated, or is it really instilled into the Labour Party? Or
no, he handled it entirely the wrong way. But first, it needs to be said, particularly here in the East End, anti-Semitism is a real thing. Every day I retweet the output of the Auschwitz Museum, pictures of children and women and men that were systematically industrialized, mass murdered. 6 million Jews were mass murdered. Yep. In the lifetime of some people that are still alive today. I mean, it finished just 9 years before I was born. This is not ancient history. This very day, there's an incident in Stamford Hill where a car has mounted the pavement and mown down a number of people. I don't have further particulars, but the fact that it was Stamford Hill makes me extremely anxious about what the details will be. Yeah. So anti-Semitism is a real thing. And it is incumbent on everybody, particularly someone who regards themselves as a socialist, to be on their guard, not only about their own language and their own thinking, but on guard against other people evincing anti-Semitic thoughts, words. And I do, because I'm on the media every day, 7 days a week, many of them phone-in shows. I can tell, I can spot coming down the pipe before you even hear it, what's coming next. And I have always jumped on from a great height and with great force anything that is headed off in the direction of anti-Semitism. But what Corbyn failed to do, and it was, for me, the most painful of failures, was to argue strong enough or well enough that opposition to the crimes of the Israeli government have nothing to do with anti-Semitism. That would be like saying that my hatred of the Saudi royal family and its dictatorship was somehow a hatred of Muslims or Islam. It's as absurd as that. And Corbyn failed clearly to articulate that point. I tried daily, trust me, to influence that, but I failed. Others were presumably trying to influence that from an alternative point of view, and he listened to them rather than me. And so, whilst it wasn't anti-Semitism that caused the collapse of Corbynism, it was a mortal wound that weakened him and Labour to the point that when the Brexit issue crystallised in the run-up to the last election, it was curtains.
Yeah, because Corbyn was anti-EU since day dot.
He sat next to me for nearly 30 years. I can assure you, I can promise you, he hated the EU and all its works. But he campaigned for Remain in the referendum in 2016. He had no need to. He could have said, as Mr. Wilson, of whom I spoke earlier, as Mr. Wilson said in the initial referendum in 1975, this is a free vote. Everyone can paddle their own canoe. The Labour cabinet at the time split. Mr. Benn, Mr. Foote and others voting to come out of the EEC. Mr. Jenkins, Callaghan and so on campaigning to remain. So there was precedent for it, and he could have done that, and he should have done it. But in any case, once the referendum had clearly decided by 1.5 million votes that we were leaving the EU, it was absolutely compulsory for him to become the champion of, well, that's it. The people have decided we're leaving.
Yeah.
Now let's concentrate on what deal we're going to leave with. In other words, the issue of principle is already decided, and we will never return to it. But he allowed himself to be bullied and browbeaten and outmaneuvered by his own friends sitting round about him to reopen the question of leave or remain, to promise a second referendum, to make people vote again until they got it right.
Yeah.
And that's fatal, and it proved fatal on the Red Wall and beyond it. Because people voted for Brexit for a reason. They didn't vote because of what it said on the side of a bus. They voted because of their real lived experience of the previous 40 years. They said, we've had 40 years of this, and look at the state we're in. We might as well try something different. That's why they voted for Brexit.
The thing that infuriates me about that as well, especially in the Brexit vote, and how you will have some of the politicians that say anyone that voted to obviously leave the EU of ill education. They're not aware. They don't fit the narrative that we believe.
Thick, yeah.
So you're thick.
Yeah.
And
well, I've lived, especially in London.
Yeah.
I've lived with this now for nearly 5 years. I'm frequently working in buildings where I'm the only person that supported Brexit, and it's quite confusing for them because, if I say so myself, they can't really think I'm thick. So they have to scratch their head and say, well, what are we going to say about him?
Yeah,
I know. We'll say he's a racist. Oh, wait a minute. He's got 5 mixed race children. He's represented more minority ethnic communities in Parliament than anybody in history. He's a prominent anti-racist internationalist campaigner for 40 years or more, but we'll call him it anyway in the hope that it sticks. And this throwing of ists and obes and isms at people, labeling them rather than arguing with them, is one of the curses of modern politics.
I wanted to pick you up on that because that's a great point. It just seems to be this toxic movement that's going on. And if you, I would pick up BLM because I was going to ask you about that actually. And obviously, you know, we look at BLM, there's a racism issue in this country. There always has been. In America, it's even worse, especially with the police. And you just take the instance of the Millwall team, that fans that booed the players taking the knee for BLM. Now, they don't pick up the fact is that the BLM movement, of course, defund the police. You know, they have. There's been riots on the streets. They've defaced our monuments. They've had fights on the police on the streets of London. And if you was to question that and say, well, hold on, this isn't right, what's going on, but because they're booing, they're deemed racist. If you question that narrative, you are a racist. You can't say anything against that movement because it's of that ilk. You know, you can't even go there anymore, even though there's something that's right or wrong. Even if it's wrong, you can't question it because it's that subject. Do you understand? I don't.
I do entirely. Look, at its base, and I'm going to build on that base, but at its base, if you've got the right to take the knee, I've got the right to boo you.
Yeah.
You can't have it both ways. And so the criminalization, demonization, vilification of people with different points of view has gone so far in this country that a good friend of mine, Paul Embry, he's a fireman. He's spent the last 25 years plunging into burning buildings. He's a trade union activist. He was the leader of the London Fire Brigades Union. He was pro-Brexit. He got sacked from his union job for giving a speech on a Friday night in his own time at a Brexit rally. He's now written a book called Despised, in which he argues that the so-called left has so fallen out of love with the British working class that the British working class hate them and they hate the British working class. Now Paul Embry is under attack and threat of being cancelled. His book shouldn't be sold. The distributor should stop selling it to even. It's going like hot cakes, by the way. The book that they try to ban always does.
Yeah.
So here we've got, by the way, whose wife is Indian and he has 3 mixed race children. This mentality is madness. And of course, it alienates still further the people you've already alienated.
Yeah.
Because I might think, by the way, I wouldn't have booed anybody
for
kneeing.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have been kneeing.
No.
For religious reasons, I kneel only for God. I don't kneel for any other purpose or to any other person. Secondly, because I think this thing has run its course. It was a splendid, spontaneous response to a grotesque, racially motivated murder in the United States. But that doesn't mean we have to adopt that form of protest at every occasion forever.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, there are many oppressed groups in the world, and there are many crimes being perpetrated in the world that are not white police officers in America kneeling on the necks of black people. And it's wrong to reduce everything to this one form of protest against one form of oppression. Now, I'm not a Millwall fan, but I have been there. The late and great Bob Crow, the leader of Britain's railwaymen, was the most famous Millwall fan. He used to sing, "No one likes us, we don't care." Millwall fans, overwhelmingly white, though not exclusively, overwhelmingly working class, in an impoverished part of London, are themselves the victims of different forms of oppression. It's true a policeman will not stop and search them quite as often as a black man. It's true that they're less likely to be killed in custody if they are arrested than a black man. But it's equally true that white working class people in Britain have been completely abandoned by the political and economic system. And in fact, not really in relation to the Afro-Caribbean communities, But by comparison, say, with the Sikh or Hindu or Muslim populations in Britain, the white working class people are even worse off. Because in the Muslim community, for example, you have extended family structures which have persisted. You have far less likelihood of broken marriage. Only 1 in 10 of Britain's Asian population have one-parent families. 25% of white families are one-parent families. 50% of Afro-Caribbean families are one-parent families. Social breakdown, community, whatever the opposite of cohesion is, incohesion, community chaos, no community centres. Let's take a place called Dagenham. When I came to London, Dagenham had a Ford motor plant where thousands of people worked in high-paid, blue-collar, trade unionised jobs. Everybody had a council house. There was a municipal swimming pool. There was a municipal library. There was a municipal theatre. There was a community. Now all of those things are gone. And that community has been either scattered to the four winds or has been driven down from the proud working class place they were in the time I've been in London, which is, say, since 1983. The white working class never features in any discourse in public life. They do worse at school than all other communities, including Afro-Caribbean. They are amongst the long-term unemployed in enormous numbers. They're in the prison population in enormous numbers. They're in the mental health territory in enormous numbers. A lot of them join the armed forces, and when they come out, they end up in prison or on the street or suffering from mental health problems, and nobody talks about them. No. Now, I first identified this on BBC Question Time at the time of the Raoul Moat affair. I don't know if you recall, when Gaza went down to the woods with a fish supper and cans of beer, and
I remember it very well,
and so on. I was on Question Time that night, and I began to talk in the way I've just been talking to you. And you'd think I'd defecated in church. The liberals all around me looked at me, why is he saying these words? And that was 10 years ago. And in the 10 years since, everything I've just said to you has become more and more abundantly clear. So what am I saying? I'm saying Millwall fans have got a chip on their shoulder too, because life ain't great for the white working class in Britain either. The task, therefore, is to bring everybody with a grievance together, not to divide them, and to divide them more by calling them names if they don't agree with your precise tactic at any particular time, but to find the one thing that unites all of these people. And what is that thing? It's called class. Because if you are dependent on your work to live, then you have a common interest that unites you with everybody else in that boat and divides you from the small, tiny number in our community, in our population, that doesn't depend on their work to live. They depend on somebody else's work to live. They depend on yours, mine, his, hers to live. That's the fundamental division in the world, in the country, in the society. And the task for someone like me, a socialist, an agitator of some repute, is to unite people, not to divide them. So that's why I'm against the policies of capital BLM, Not against the idea that Black Lives Matter. That would be absurd. But the capital B, capital L, capital M movement is inherently divisive. Its demands cannot be met and will not be countenanced by ordinary people. Defund the police, for example, being one of them. Who are you going to call? If you've defunded the police,
just
who are you going to call?
I know.
When somebody's climbing through your window in the middle of the night.
I know.
Ridiculous.
And you made a great point about what you brought up on Question Time, and that was 10 years ago. But it seems like now everyone's opinion is so polarized. It's either extreme left or extreme right. And if you was to have a general conversation with someone, and now it's turned into, and I've noticed in the last 10 years, is that they end up, disliking you because you've got a difficult political opinion to someone.
Sure.
And I don't know whether that's the implementation of social media and the way that they influence it. You only look at certain things that you want to see, and when anyone else actually has a different opinion to you, you attack them.
Yeah, and you call them names.
Yeah,
if they don't agree that men can declare themselves to be women and go into the female changing room at the baths, you're a transphobe.
Yep. It's just...
Well, I'm not.
No.
But I do have a wife and I do have daughters, and I don't want a man in their changing room. That doesn't make me a transphobe.
No. Okay.
If I saw a trans person outside being bullied or harmed in any way, I would literally give my blood standing beside them to defend them. I'm not a transphobe. I just got a point of view on these matters. And that in today's world means you have to be cancelled. If I had a job if I didn't have my own media, if I was working on Good Morning Britain, and I just said to you what I just said to you, I'd already be sacked.
Yeah, you would be, yeah.
Just think about that.
I know. And do you think that's why, you're sort of a maverick politician, dealing with what you dealt with in Iraq and speaking out the way you did? Do you find now, especially the way politics has changed, people are more career politicians, they don't actually engage with their constituents, they're not actually trying to help people, which is the whole process of it? Do you think they're more just looking out for themselves now, and you haven't got them old school politicians that are actually going to stand up and speak for what's right and wrong? And is that why we're in this situation? Because when anyone seems to question the narrative or question, as you've just demonstrated, you're attacked, you're ridiculed in public, you're cancelled.
Cancelled is the main thing, because we've always been attacked. There's no problem with being attacked. The problem is being cancelled. You see, all of my life, I have been attacked for the point of view that I hold. Mr. Ben, who's young right-hand man for a time I was attacked mercilessly as the most dangerous man in Britain and so on. But he was never cancelled. Nobody said he can't sit in Parliament. You can't interview him on TV. You can't give him a platform in a university to address a public meeting. You can't allow him to rent the Camden Town Hall to address people. You must cancel him, non-person him. Nobody said that, but that's what they say now. So I myself, for example, having spent decades speaking at universities and schools, no longer do, because I know that as soon as I accept an invitation, which still come in, there'll be a move to cancel me. And if it's not cancelled, they'll probably try and attack me on the campus. So why would I put myself through that? And so we now reached the absurd situation where the only schools that I continue to speak to are Eton and Harrow and Wellington and the most expensive private schools in the land. They're the only places where the wish to hear different points of view still exists. In the state schools, let's say the local school here invited me to speak, as once upon a time they would regularly have done. As soon as it was known that I was going to speak, any number of issue groups, single issue groups, feminist groups, transgender groups, I don't know what, would say, no, and it would be cancelled. This is a very, very bad idea.
It's extremely... Where's it going to go? Is this going to evolve? Is it going to get worse?
It is getting worse at the moment. When I saw Paul Embry on the verge now of being cancelled for writing a book, that's just about as low as it's got so far. And it will, of course, change. Everything must pass. But there's no present sign of it passing anytime soon. And people are passing laws enshrining the right of men to, a trans woman is a woman. If you don't accept that, you'll be put to the stake. You will not literally yet be burned at that stake, but you will be pilloried and you will be invalidated and you will be cancelled. That's a very dire situation and a very dangerous one because, of course, it's that issue today. It could be a different issue tomorrow. And before you know it, the population is inured, inoculated, vaccinated into a state of mind where the prevailing orthodoxy is what counts. And if you're outside of that prevailing orthodoxy, you will be cancelled. And that would be fine if the prevailing orthodoxy was invariably right. But it is invariably wrong. The prevailing orthodoxy was that we must invade Iraq, that Iraq was bristling with chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. That was the prevailing orthodoxy. And that was entirely wrong. So, you see my point? If there's no ability of people to say, hey, you're actually going the wrong way down the street here, you'll keep walking down the street, and if I was right, you'll be hit by the oncoming traffic.
I 100% agree with you. It gets in these situations now, and you look at Question Time, and I was watching it yesterday, and you have people talk about certain issues, and you just think, well, hold on, that's wrong. But because it's part of this narrative, and what we're doing is allowing these politicians or these people to carry on speaking this without even being contested. And the more they're allowed to do it, the more it evolves without someone saying, no, hold on, this is wrong. What you're saying is wrong. You need to be contested. This is not right. But because it's part of this narrative and it seems to be this toxic movement, it just seems to be getting worse. For me.
Sure. There are millions of us who feel this way.
Yeah,
so all is not lost. But how old is the proverb of the emperor has no clothes? It's very old. But our society, even then, knew that somebody has to be allowed to say, actually, you've got no clothes. You are wrong. What you're saying is untrue. If you don't have that, then you will double down and double down and double down on blunders and mistakes, and you end up killing 1 million people in Iraq. In the run-up to the war, I was treated on the BBC, at least I got on the BBC in those days, but I was treated as if I was either mad or bad or both. And the country was marched into what you described as possibly the biggest blunder in history. Now, that alone, quite apart from the million other examples I could adduce, that alone makes the case that we must preserve freedom of speech, because otherwise we will not hear what actually might turn out to be what we needed to hear.
100% agree, yeah. 100% agree. And I've always seen you on TV, actually. And, I'm more of a centralist in history, leaning right. I don't know about now or what I actually think about politics, but I always respected you because you always spoke your opinion, always stood out, and you didn't care what anyone said. And I remember you on Question Time, and I watched you in the Senate as well. And you are certainly a man of your word. You certainly are. But I wanted to pick up with you about Trump and Biden as well, and what your thoughts on that. And that seems to be, again, extremely polarizing. You've got the centralist America that seem to be on Trump's side, and then you've got the east and western states, other than Florida, obviously, that are with Biden. And it just seems to be severe over there as well, with polarizing opinions.
Yeah, even more. I'm on American television 5 days a week, so I know more about the American political setup than most people in this country, and I correctly predicted that Donald Trump would be elected in 2016. In fact, I won a lot of money at the bookies on it. I predicted that he'd be the candidate, and I predicted that he would beat Hillary Clinton. And I did so publicly on the radio and so on. And again, people thought I was nuts, but I was right. And I understood the reasons for Trump, which is actually remarkably similar to the reasons for Brexit. The area, flyover America that you just described, is, of course, where most of the people live, or at least where most of the Electoral College votes come from. The people who felt abandoned, betrayed by the political class, the people whose factories disappeared overnight, unbolted from the floor and moved to Mexico, or shipped to China. The Rust Belt, as they're described, the Rust Belt states, are exactly analogous to the post-industrial areas of Britain that voted for Brexit. People who once had something and then no longer had anything. And so when asked, would you like to endorse the prevailing orthodoxy, declined to do so. Well, that's exactly what happened. People were asked to vote for the very wife of the man who signed the NAFTA and destroyed industrial America. How stupid is that? But even if she hadn't been his wife, she was the personification of a political class, just like the political class we have that you described well earlier, that doesn't give a toss for the ordinary Joe or Joanne, who are doing well, really well, in the case of American politicians, phenomenally well. Nancy Pelosi is a multi-millionaire, and she's never done anything except be a congresswoman.
Yeah, it's strange how that is.
It's funny how that happens. The plight of the average American was spoken to by Trump. Now, he turned out not actually to do anything about it, but the message he gave, that these people are mugging you, they don't give a toss about you, they are a swamp, and their media is a fake news media, and this all resonated with the American public because it was true. And so that kind of populist message that Trump delivered, I was clear was going to win. And it even got 74 million votes after 4 catastrophic years in which he didn't keep most of the promises that he made them all again. I'll do it next time.
Make America great again.
And of course, the coronavirus, which has killed more people than have died in any of America's wars. It's over 300,000 now and increasing. So it's a miracle that Trump got 74 million votes. It's a miracle that he didn't get completely annihilated, but in fact got the second highest vote in history. And he'll be back, he or somebody like him. Maybe a smoother Trump.
Someone who's not a PR nightmare.
Maybe somebody who's not a PR nightmare, someone who's not on tape about all the vulgar, dirty things that he's said and done and so on. Somebody with a bit more credibility, but the same message. Although Trump had a bit of charisma, you do need a bit of charisma. But if that sort of person comes along, you wait and see what happens.
It's interesting. I completely agree with you on that as well. And I'll go back to what you said about trying to bring people together and how people are polarized in their opinion. It seems like the way the political system is set up is in order to have people polarized like that. And that's why I'm worried and concerned about where it's going to go in the future and how people's opinions are so divided. Do you think the structure and way the political system set up will allow someone to be able to engage with both sides and sort of amalgamate rather than actually creating more of a divide?
It is difficult. We did it over Brexit. So you had people like me and people like Farage, very different people, but on the same side on that issue. It can, in the post-Brexit era, be replicated when we, get to discussing and debating what kind of Britain we're going to have now that we're free of the European Union. It's happening now. I'm doing it in Scotland, where I'm the leader of something which is cross-party, broad political alliance to try and defeat the SNP and the breakup of Britain. So it can happen, but it is difficult with our electoral system. We have, unlike on the European mainland, a first-past-the-post system. I myself here's how hard it is. I'm the only person ever to win 2 seats as an independent.
It's incredible.
So that's how hard it is.
Yeah. Well, financially, you must have the backing in order to do.
Luckily in Britain, you don't need to spend. In fact, you're not allowed to spend a lot of money.
No.
There's a strict limit on what you can spend in elections. Thankfully, that's the one asset we've got over the United States, where they spend $1 billion each on their elections. But it's very, very hard because you've got to break through the habits of a lifetime. People are either Labour or they're Tory, and they got that from their father, who got it from their father.
Yeah.
I mean, I lived in a time where if you knocked on a door and canvassed somewhere and a woman came to the door, she'd say, you'll need to wait till my man's in. This habit in Britain, political habit, needs to be broken. You need now. 100%. It has been greatly weakened, but it's not entirely dead. But it's hard to pitch up in a place you've scarcely been before and say, vote for me. You've got the media against you in a big, big way, in my case. And therefore still to do it, it's hard. But we don't have any alternative but to keep trying, because the alternative is to surrender and go under. And I'm not ready to do that.
That's certainly not in your character, George, is it? No. So what are you doing now, George? You're presenting, is it RT you present on now?
Yes, I'm on RT America 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. I'm on RT UK on a Saturday with a program called Sputnik with my wife, orbiting the world, Sputnik. And then on a Sunday, it's my extravaganza. So I have a 3-hour live phone-in on a Sunday night between 7 and 10. It's called the mother of all talk shows. It started out on Talk Sport. It then went to America, to WBAI in America and Wall Street. Wow. Then it came back to talk radio. And now it's on RT and Sputnik. So you can listen on Sputnik radio, or you can watch on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Twitch. it has an audience of more than 1 million every Sunday.
Wow.
And we made it all ourselves.
That's fantastic.
And
it's me telling you I've got 10,000 views.
That's why I'm keen that you should succeed, and I believe that you will succeed.
Thank you.
Because there is an audience. It's just got to find you. And you've just got to find it. Now, as I said to you when we were coming up the stairs, there's never been a better time to do this. There's never been a worse time to get paid for it. That's the problem.
100% right. 100% right.
But anyway, it's been a pleasure, real pleasure. And this is my new book.
Yep.
Brand new. You are the first person in the world to have my children's book. Now, here's the origin of that. Well, I have 6 children, and all of them loved pirates.
Yeah.
The problem for parents is that pirates are pretty poor role models. They do all sorts of unspeakable things. So, what about if we could find a good pirate, a Robin Hood type pirate, who doesn't cut people's throats, who doesn't steal other people's things? In fact, he steals the things that other people stole and gives it back to them.
All right.
And that is Red Malacca. So it's my first children's book. I've written many books. I've still got on the market at the moment my first novel, which was a counterfactual history of what would have happened if Hitler had conquered us, who would have fought him, who would have collaborated with him. That's called Queensway, and the sequel to it is called Black Lake, and that'll be out quite soon too. But this is my first children's book, so anybody that's got children, grandchildren, nephews, nieces, if you want to allow them to love pirates, but good pirates, this is the book for you.
Fantastic.
It's only $5.99.
And where's that? Amazon?
You'll get it everywhere. It'll be on Amazon. You can get it directly from me, signed from georgegalloway.com. But it'll hopefully in all good bookshops. But it's literally off the press. You're the first person.
See, I'm the first
to get one.
Special service. George, it's been fantastic.
Pleasure was mine.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Tune in to the next show. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.